Most newcomers to Ponyville are caught off guard by the Ponyville General Hospital. For such a small and relatively rural village, Ponyville's medical facilities were surprisingly top-notch. A great deal of the credit can be laid squarely at the hoofs of the town's industrious mayor. Marilyn Mayer routinely put health care at the forefront of her platform and, unlike many politicians, she stuck firmly to her promises. In her own words, a healthy populace is both happy and productive, and the business of running a town is no business at all if the town's ponies are not taken care of. Her consecutive mayoral terms resulted in one of the finest medical establishments outside of any major city, with a staff of doctors and nurses who possess a level of experience incomparable to Manhattan Medical Center or Canterlot General. Fluttershy had known all this on an intellectual level. The mayor's health policies were among the big reasons Fluttershy had always been happy to vote for Marilyn on election day. Never before had she held a reason to be grateful for their mayor's foresight, though, except perhaps that time Rainbow crashed mid-stunt. Fluttershy had been waiting outside the ICU alongside Rainbow Dash for the past hour, while Twilight had gone in to aid in examination almost 45 minutes ago. To no one's surprise, it turned out that their friend had, among her many earned and honorary degrees, a doctorate in advanced medical arcana. Rainbow Dash had vacillated between being an emotional wreck and catatonic with worry, and Fluttershy had been doing her best to comfort her friend. Scooter was like family to the Cyan Pegasus, though, and the filly's current condition combined with the finding out that she had been orphaned by neglectful parents had hit Rainbow Dash particularly hard, since she hadn't known anything about it. According to Dash, Scootaloo had never mentioned it, and the fact that she had hid something so important from the mayor who thought of Scootaloo as a little sister had hurt the little Pegasus deeply. The door to the ICU opened, cutting off Fluttershy's thoughts, as Twilight trotted out wearing a grim expression, along with her pale blue scrubs. Fluttershy, Rainbow, I finished the examination and... What is it? Rainbow shouted, zipping up to Twilight and stopping inches from her face. Is Scoot's going to be okay? Please tell me she's going to be okay. Twilight let out a sigh. I don't know, Dash. That's what I was going to say. As far as I can tell, whatever is affecting her is definitely magical in nature, but it's also physical. The closest I've ever seen to this kind of magic is a poison joke from the Everfree. It's like a curse or a hex, except it seems to reside in Scootaloo's bloodstream. So she needs blood then, right? Rainbow Dash answered with a desperate edge to her voice. I can do that. How much do you need? Take it! Stepping back, Twilight put a hoof to Rainbow's chest and gave her a softful look. That's very generous of you, Rainbow. But we've already tried that. Something in Scootaloo's blood is attacking the infused blood, even though it shouldn't. It's like the magic is defending itself. Could she have wandered into the Everfree and contracted something? Fluttershy asked softly. She hated the words even as they passed her lips. She knew exactly, well, not exactly, but near enough, what had happened to Scootaloo. She felt her heart wrench a little as Twilight nodded. That's the working theory, Twilight answered. Since so much of the forest is uncharted and so little is known about the plant life, she may have eaten something toxic and only realized it later. Thanks to Lester, she had the good sense to try to make it to the hospital. I didn't even want to imagine what would happen if she hadn't. How did she even get out there? Rainbow asked dejectedly. The purple alicorn shuffled through some papers and were floating nearby. According to the orphanage's head, Gentle Hearth, Scootaloo had a bad habit of running away from the grounds. Twilight answered sadly. She had a lot of marks on her record, problems with authority mostly. According to her caseworker, Scootaloo's parents essentially adored her. I suppose after so long of taking care of herself and her adult supervision being mostly ineffective, this isn't so surprising. So what's going to happen to her? Rainbow asked, her voice cracking. Twilight shook her head. I don't know, Dash. She's stable right now, so that's good. But frankly, without knowing the root cause of what's happening to her, I can't say it will last. Fluttershy could feel the guys tying her tongue every time she thought about telling them the truth. Sombra had said that Scootaloo would be fine, but what if he was wrong? If my friends knew that monster did something to Scootaloo, maybe they could help her. There was a mute point, though. Fluttershy knew. Stupid, stupid guys. If something happened to Skulu, I'll never forgive him. Hey? Rainbow said suddenly. She had a look in her eye like a light had just come on. What about that new guy? The one staying with Flutters? Fluttershy's ears perked up at a surge of fear. Cole? What about him? Of course! Twilight nearly shouted, her face lighting up. Cole said he was here to study the flora and fauna of the Everfree. Maybe his research has something useful. Skulu got all the way to Ponyville General, so she couldn't have made it that far into the forest, which means she probably encountered whoever did this here near the verge of the forest. This is it. This is my chance. Oh, well, I don't know about that. What am I saying? I just need to say yes. If I say yes, then he's only just started his research after all. I think he's only been out a few times. Then they'll take him away. They'll imprison him in a stone like Discord was, or worse. I suppose I could ask him, but I think Sakura might be a better choice. Twilight tapped her chin with her hoof before nodding, letting out a deep, discrepanted chuckle. Yeah, you're probably right. I should have known better anyway. If anyone knows how long it takes to get actionable results from a long-term study, you'd think it would be me. Still, can you ask him to keep an eye on Everfree varied flora, and let us know if he finds anything that might suggest a toxic nature? Of course, Fluttershy answered, with lightness she far from felt. I'm sure he'd be happy to help in any way. I'll go to Sakura's place, Rainbow declared. She's probably asleep, but we're talking about serious stuff here. We should have thought of her first. Without another word, Rainbow turned to a prismatic blur, making a beeline to the edge of the forest path leading to Sakura's hut. Fluttershy felt a weight settle in her gut as she watched Fluttershy vanish into the forest. I'm lying to my friends for him, she realized. I can't blame the guys for this either. It was me. I decided to do this. Even though Skulu's life might be in danger, I protected him. What have I done? Sombra tossed and turned restlessly in his new bed. Although he was asleep, the dark stallion did not find rest quite so easily. His mind felt fevered as shadows wrapped coyly around his mind. Whispers filled his thoughts of visions of black crystals, Clypean monuments, and dark, cavernous vaults. He knew the shapes and places before him. Even in his troubled sleeps, he knew the locations that his mind was being pulled toward. Why, though? Why am I here? Sombra muttered as he looked down at the sunken temple that his dreams had brought him to. There was a monstrosity of twisted pillars and elegant sweeping shapes that defied geometry. This place must have been scourged from the face of the Equestria 1,000 years ago. The sisters would not have left even one of these sites standing. This was no memory either. There was none of the Dark Templar who served as devoted guardians, no priests keeping the black flames endlessly lit. It was empty, and yet not. There was more than just the howling winds winding through the pillars. Scowling, Sombra drifted forward, his astral form moving the dream realm around him hazily. The temple had been built to exist collectively in the waking and the dream realms, but its destruction should have been equally mirrored. If it was here, then that meant... Impossible, Sombra growled. If this temple had survived, it would have been revived much sooner than with much more strength. Then I woke so far from my empire means it must have been destroyed. That made sense. The logic was there, and yet, so was the temple. All logic pointed to the temple being destroyed except for its existence of the dream realm. Sombra hated not knowing what was happening. He especially hated being left in confusion over matters of his own kingdom. Well, former kingdom. As he made his way amidst the pillars and cold fire pits, Sombra examined the temple's grounds. They were just as he remembered them, carved from black crystal and basalt, excavated from the mountains and nearby quarries, and etched with spells almost as old as the Wendigo. They were almost as much a work of art as of industry. The temple had served as a focal point for Sombra's growing power in the past, and had used the geometric architecture to empower his spells, allowing him to craft impossible works of magic and architect. It was the depths of this very temple that the first shadow golem had been shaped. A surge of shadow and wind tore suddenly from the far end of the temple grounds, where the subterfuge would have laid, to slam violently into Sombra's scattering thoughts like snow. Amidst the howling gale, Sombra could hear the whispers of both familiar and alien. His memories tried to dredge up the sound, but it was so faint. Then it was gone, and the tentative memory left with it. Frustrated, Sombra prowled onward. He was determined to divine the source of this impossible temple. He had crafted it for a purpose, and, with his fall and subsequent cope of the Empire, it no longer had one. If it was not destroyed during the purges that followed his defeat, a millennium passed, then that meant the sisters must have decided on a use for it. There are few things Sombra hated more than someone doing as they would with his own things. He would shake the temple down to its very foundation, stone rather permitted to be used by the pair of winged fancies that called themselves princesses, especially the last scorn of the cadenza line. The entrance to the temple was a wide, gaping archway that opened up to a set of pillars sized perfectly for Sombra's immense frame. It gave other, more average ponies a sense of deportion, not unlike a young colt trying to wear his father's jacket. Sombra could feel the presence of a mind deep beneath his hoofs. It was old, powerful, and hateful. It was filled with hatred, jealousy, rage, and spite, cold around a heart as black as night. More importantly, though, it was occupying his temple. Whatever this creature was, A sound interrupted the former king's thoughts. It was coming from far away, far beyond the walls of sleep and in the waking world. Sombra's ears flicked back reflectively, trying to pinpoint the noise. Turning away from the temple's maw, Sombra scowled in annoyance. It shouldn't be possible for a sound from the waking realm to reach him here. In dreams, perhaps, but this was far beyond the simple place of dreams and deep within the winding matter of magic. That he assumed this realm via dreams should be of no consequence. Curious, Sombra focused on the sound in an effort to bring it into clarity. After a moment of concentration, he succeeded, and the sound became clear as day. It was the sound of some pony crying. No, not some pony. It was the mouse's voice. A surge of panic and anger cracked Sombra's icy demeanor, splitting his focus in two like a drop of porcelain plate. He cast a brief gaze back at the portal to the dark depths before shaking his head. The temple and its invading occupant will be here tomorrow evening, Sombra thought as he began the enormous of dawn, lifting his spirit from the deep places of sleep and back to his body. I will deal with them on the morrow. For now, I clearly have more important matters to attend to, namely whoever made my servant weep. Sombra blinked sleep from his eyes as he lifted his head from the pillow a bit begrudgingly. Glancing at the clock, Sombra scowled. It was just past 2 a.m. Even farmers were not up so early without a very good reason. Moments later, the feather-soft sounds of crying reached Sombra's ears in the waking world. Ah, yes, Sombra grumbled. My reason. Lifting himself out of bed, Sombra made his way out of his room and down the hall to his servants' bedchambers. He could hear her crying, though it was muffled. She was likely trying to keep it to herself, and for some reason, that irked Sombra more than being awoken by it. Pushing her door open, he saw Fluttershy curled up on top of her blankets, and shaking every so often another sob would escape, followed by a hiccup and more shaking. A small sense of relief passed through Sombra's mind when he saw that she was unhurt, physically at least. More anger followed quickly on its heels, however, as he wondered who had brought his servant to such a dismal state. Anger that quickly became a dark, cold fury. I would know why you shed so many tears, Mouse. Sombra's voice was a distant thunder, caged in a shell of iron. Despite its low volume, Fluttershy still started as if she had been shocked. Shadows flicked and writhed around Sombra as his eyes took on a full green, latent glow. Lavender flames licked off the edge of his scala as his face twisted into a furious mane. If there is a culprit, I would have their name or names. Fluttershy stared at Sombra for a moment, before quickly wiping away the tears from her face. It did little but muss up her fur, which matted from tears, and her eyes unavoidably red from crying. I'm sorry, Master, Fluttershy hiccuped. Sombra could still hear the tears standing on the edge of her voice. I didn't mean to wake you. I'll try and be quieter. Did you not hear me, Mouse? The Buttercup Mare blinked in surprise. It wasn't any pony's fault, Your Majesty. No one did this to me. The flames and shadows calmed somewhat as Sombra tilted his head in confused irritation. Then why do you weep as if you were racked to your very soul? Fluttershy swallowed and sniffled a little before answering. Because I did something terrible. I don't know what to do. I made a choice and now... A sigh stifled Fluttershy's self-recriminatory rant before it could gain steam. I see, Sombra said softly, gone from the looming specter of destruction, replaced by his normal, albeit exceptionally lemon frame. Tell me, what do you think you have done? As he spoke, Sombra stepped close to the bed and sat in front of her. Fluttershy looked pensive for several moments before Sombra knew there was no point in pressing the issue. She will tell me her troubles, Sombra thought idly to himself. It is in her nature. It is pony nature to rely on others, no matter that I am hardly an ideal candidate. Well, Fluttershy began, sniffling. I lied to my friends to protect you. Sombra cocked an eyebrow in confusion. That's all. The guy forces you to protect me, Mouse. If you become distraught over every little lie you are forced to... It wasn't your stupid magic! Fluttershy yelled, startling Sombra. Fluttershy clamped her hoof to her mouth, horrified at what had just come out of it. I am so sorry, Your Majesty. I didn't mean to. I was just so angry and... Sombra silenced her with a raised hoof. Clarify what you just said to me, Mouse, he said once she had quieted down. What do you mean it wasn't my magic? Fluttershy blinked in surprise, but nodded. Twilight and Rainbow were trying to figure out what had happened to Skulu when Twilight said that the magic on her resembled something like a plant in the Everfree could do. A physical curse, she called it? Rainbow suggested they talk to Cole, since you're supposed to be studying the Everfree plants. When they asked me if I thought it was a good idea, I said no. If he was being honest, Sombra felt rocked back on his hooves. By pure chance, the mouse's friends had given her an opportunity to betray him fully into the grasp of his enemies, without triggering the conditions of the guise. He had been sleeping, and his walk had left him weary. He had only himself to blame for his short-sighted encroachments of the young Pegasus. Fate and his own judgment had left him solely at the hoofs of the shy mare in front of him. And yet, she had protected him. I told them that your research was barely started and that you wouldn't have anything useful, Fluttershy continued. I promised then I would ask if Cole would keep an eye out for any plants that matched the description, and they believed me. At this point, Fluttershy had broken back down into quiet sobs. Sombra could feel himself becoming more and more frustrated. Not with the mouse, not even with her friends. He was getting frustrated with himself. She had protected him for reasons he couldn't begin to fathom. She had only served him for mere days, and she had been given a seemingly golden opportunity to remove herself from under his hoof. She didn't, and now she was berating herself for the action she had taken instead. This bothered Sombra. The fact that it bothered him, in turn, frustrated him. I took advantage of my friends, Fluttershy choked out. I know you said the scooter would be alright, but I can't be sure, and if she isn't, then it'll be all my fault. I'm a horrible pony. You will forgive me if that complaint rings a bit hollow in present company, Sombra stated dryly. His borderline sarcastic tone served to snap Fluttershy out of her wallowing, however, as she looked at him in shock. Sombra wrinkled his muzzle in annoyance. You are bound to serve to a tyrant, Mouse. You are practically sainted in comparison. Besides, you cannot know what would have happened had you agreed to your friend's request. I may be weak, but do not underestimate the damage I am capable of inflicting if threatened. You very likely preserved at least one of your friends' lives by deterring them from their ill-advised course of action. That may be laying it on a bit thick, Sombra mused as he watched as the gears turned the mouse's brain. I am not precisely defenseless in my current state, but I suspect a good maiming is a general estimate of the damage I can inflict before I would be overpowered. Regardless of the veracity of his statement, Sombra felt a small sense of relief when some of the grief left the mouse's features. She was still horrified by her choices, unsurprisingly, but she was no longer inconsolable. Why that mattered to him at all, he wasn't certain. Sombra did know that her crying had an unparalleled quality to it that had served to disturb his rest, but that was far from the only reason. Have I truly come to care for this mare? Sombra felt a wariness in him as he asked himself the question. Indulging that impulse is, what utmost certainly, a bad idea of the highest order. Given her status as a bearer, my happening to sneeze within a league of her would be enough to bring down the wrath of the sisters on my head. Your Majesty? Fluttershy's voice snapped Sombra out of his thoughts as he felt his heart make a sudden leap for his throat when he realized she had gotten almost uncomfortably close to him, with her muzzle only a foot away at most. Are you all right? Yes, Sombra rumbled, as he stood up from where he had come to rest at her bedside and turned his back on her. I am quite all right. Now I expect you to sleep now. My guides will keep you dreamless and ensure you rest as undisturbed as I hope mine shall be. Oh, Fluttershy entered meekly. I'm sorry for waking you. Sombra shot a glance over her massive shoulder. Rest, Mouse. Surprisingly, Fluttershy didn't flinch at his tone or his gaze. She just smiled the same radiant smile she always did. It comforted him to see it. As you say, Your Majesty, Fluttershy replied, bowing her head slightly, and thank you for trying to cheer me up. Sombra refused to dignify those last words with an answer and shut the bedroom door behind him. His mind was clouded and troubled. Furthermore, he was almost infuriatingly awake. Despite the early hour, he felt a certainty bordering on the prophetic that sleep would elude him as he made his way back to his own room. Pushing the door to it open, Sombra glanced down the hall toward the living room and the front door. From somewhere deep in his sorcery-blackened heart, he felt something stirring. Something utterly and infutely annoying. I could not help but wonder if my revival was somewhat botched and left me instead, Sombra thought dryly as he, instead of entering his room, delicately pulled out one of the books from his shelf and then trotted out the living room and through the front door as quietly as possible. Fluttershy woke an hour or two later than she normally would have on a usual morning. Celestia's sun was high enough in the sky to suggest mid-morning, and for the second time in a row, Fluttershy felt less than motivated to get out of bed. It wasn't as bad as the day before, but she knew that every day would bring with it fresh challenges for her to apparently fail at. Assuming she survived Sombra's guise, she had no idea how she would confess to her friends what she had done. Rainbow Dash would almost certainly never forgive her, given how much the little filly meant to the Cyan weather mare, and Fluttershy couldn't blame her at all. Hopefully the master is still asleep, Fluttershy thought suddenly as she tipped herself out of bed and onto the cold floor. Shivering, she trotted out into the hallway. He'll be upset if I made him wait for breakfast. She felt a measure of hope as she walked past his closed door and into the empty living room. The kitchen likewise showed no signs of the massive ash-colored stallion. Smiling, Fluttershy began the process of making breakfast. She chose something quick and simple, honey oatmeal with fruit, so she could get her chores faster and make up for the lost time, especially since she wanted to visit the hospital quickly to see if there had been any update on Scootaloo's condition. Leaving out a large portion for Sombra sitting covered on the table alongside the condiments in case he woke up before she returned, Fluttershy quickly and gracelessly scarfed down her bowl before leaving to finish her morning duties. When she returned an hour later to find the bowl untouched, and Sombra still nowhere to be seen, Fluttershy felt a small twinge of regret. She had woken him up in the middle of the night. He was probably catching up on sleep. He seemed more energetic at night anyways. Setting up a small warming pad to place under the bowl to keep it at a palatable temperature, Fluttershy penned a short note explaining her absence and left it by the bowl. She only stopped to grab the red scarf hanging on the rack by the door before leaving to make her way to the hospital. She could only hope that her decisions hadn't been paid for by little Scootaloo. The walk was uneventful and quiet, much as it always was, but this time Fluttershy couldn't find any peace in the quiet. For the first time she found herself getting frustrated by how far away she was from town. Abandoning her usual order of business, Fluttershy spread her wings and kicked off from the well-trodden path and caught a low thermal. She rarely flew, but that was more out of preference than lack of skill. She was a competent enough flyer, and her lean frame made her especially maneuverable. Fluttershy simply had an earth pony's preference toward keeping her hoofs on a terra firma. Her speed was far better than the air, though, like any Pegasus. Within a few minutes, Fluttershy made a graceful landing in front of Ponyville General Fund's entrance. Quickly she trotted through the doors and up to the front desk. "Excuse me," Fluttershy spoke up with unusual strength for her to the receptionist. "A kind unicorn mare named Veretti. A Pegasus filly named Scootaloo was brought in emergency care last night, and I was wondering what room she was put in." Veretti smiled. "Oh, yes. I was told that a sudden arrival. Let me check." Her voice was puzzlingly musical, and she lit her horn to bring up a large ledger to consult. After a worrying minute, Veretti smiled. "There we are, room 109. It looks like an outside consultant is currently attending her and has been for some time. However, so if he asks you to wait outside the room, I must ask that you obey him without question. All right, Miss Fluttershy?" "Oh, yes," Fluttershy agreed readily, almost relieved to hear that Scootaloo was out of intensive care. "Of course. Thank you very much, Veretti." "No problem. I think Rainbow's down there as well." Veretti pointed Fluttershy toward the hallway. "First hall on the right." Fluttershy nodded and trotted down, following Veretti's directions. Taking the first right, she saw Rainbow snoozing on a bench outside of the room where Scootaloo was supposed to be. She tried not to disturb her fellow Pegasus, who had already been there all night, but she barely made it to the bench Rainbow was sleeping on before the athletic, gnat-loving mare snapped awake. "What the—" Rainbow Dash looked around for a moment before her brain caught up with her body. "Oh, hey, Fluttershy. Is it morning?" Fluttershy nodded, feeling a pang of regret from her friend's state. "Yes, I was just coming by to check on Scootaloo. How is she doing?" Thankfully, Rainbow gave her a smile that shone with relief. "She's going to be fine. It was touch and go there for a while, but once Cole showed up, he was able to give the doctor some pointers on how to deal with it." "I can't have heard that right." Fluttershy stood stock still as what Rainbow Dash had just said. "Cole's here?" Rainbow cocked an eyebrow. Yeah. Didn't you send him over? He said he woke up after you got home and that you had told him what happened to Scoots. He must have headed over here right afterwards." I suppose so," Fluttershy agreed, trying to cover her disbelief. "I didn't realize he had left right away, though. I was so exhausted I must have fallen asleep right after I told him." "Well, I'm glad you told him, Flutters. Like I turned out he's reliable as me. I don't think he left her side the whole time. Heck, that's the only reason why I got any shut-eye at all." Rainbow stretched, her spine making loud popping noises. "Well, that's good." Fluttershy felt a little light-headed, and couldn't keep herself from repeatedly glancing at the closed door to Scootaloo's room. "I'm going to grab some coffee." Rainbow continued, unimpeded. I'll bring some for Cole, too. The dude is probably falling asleep on his host by now. You want anything? No, I'm fine. I'm just going to go check on Cole, Fluttershy answered, snapping out of her daze. Rainbow nodded at that. Yeah, probably a good idea. He's probably needs some serious R&R after this. The words fell on mostly deaf ears as Fluttershy trotted dazedly up to the door and pushed it open. She half expected him to find him conducting some strange, dark experiment, or be surrounded by shadowy coals. She was certainly not expecting to find him wearing a white coat that had been splattered with recent stains, a quill hanging idly out of his mouth that he seemed to be chewing on, and numerous clipboards floating alongside one of his grimoires, which he seemed to be reading simultaneously. Glancing back, Fluttershy kicked out with her back hoof to shut the door, making sure she heard it click. Sombra seemed entirely unaware of the noise or her presence as he muttered to himself, absent-mindedly chewing on the quill. Your Majesty, Fluttershy asked quietly as she approached. He didn't react. Should she try something a little more risky? Sombra? Not now, Misty, Sombra replied distractedly. This last sequence is giving me a runaround. I'll have it isolated in a moment, though. Misty? Oh, that was his friend from before. Fluttershy's heart hurt just a little at Sombra's reflective answer. She could tell that for the moment he wasn't in Ponyville General. He was back in the Coastal Empire. It's strange, but he looks so comfortable like this. He actually reminds me a little of Twilight. Sombra still hadn't noticed Fluttershy's existence. Instead, he floated over the particularly chewed quill and noted down a few sweeping lines and equations before snickering. That's done it. Got the little bastard. The soft squeak that escaped from Fluttershy's mouth at Sombra's words drew the disguised king's attention back to the present, and Sombra gave a small laugh at his momentary confused expression before clamping her host to her mouth before anything else could get out. Oh, I'm so sorry, Your Majesty. Fluttershy couldn't keep the slight smile on her face. It's just that you looked really good. You looked happy. The filly will live, as I said. Her life was never in any danger, although I did end up catching a few problematic side effects that may have presented themselves before they took root. I suspect they were related to her malnourishment. It is frustrating, since I should have foreseen that, and I blame my tired mind. I am glad I came out here and oversaw her recovery. His speech patterns had changed back to his kingly style, and Sombra didn't turn to regard Fluttershy at any point, instead choosing to walk over to Scootaloo's sleeping form. A small spark of magic leapt from Sombra's horn to Scootaloo's forehead and settled in. There. That should ensure she awakens in more or less the same state as when she had fallen into her slumber. Stepping back, Sombra peeled back some of the covers. The changes are settling in nicely, too. See? Fluttershy didn't bother holding back a gasp. Scootaloo's wings were the most notable change. Before they had been small and stunted with a little sign of growth in spite of her age. Now they were nearly half as big as she was, and the feathers growing from them ranged from black to deep indigo, before fading back into orange as they moved toward the main bones of the wing. There were other, subtler changes as well, though. Scootaloo had always been a little bit scrawny and lean, but now she looked as though she had been eating 3 good meals a day for the past year, and athletic muscles could be seen along her legs and back. What did you do? Fluttershy muttered, in awe of the transformation and had taken place. She looks so much healthier now. Sombra chuckled. Of course she does, but I don't have time for a lengthy explanation. Simply know that I ensured her healthy safety and soundness of body. Before this she would have been a stunted runt for life. But now she can do whatever she wants. That she will feel beholden to me is, of course, a given. Fluttershy could hardly hold back the tears that were threatening to fall as she looked over Scootaloo. She had always worried about the little filly, being so scrawny and small. Fluttershy wished she had known about the trouble that Scootaloo had faced at home, but now, thanks to Sombra, she had a chance at a normal life. It didn't matter if that had been his first intention. In fact, it probably hadn't been. But the fact remained that he had given Skulu quality life back after it had been unfairly taken away from her by neglect and apathy. So you see, Mouse, Sombra continued, you never had anything to worry about. His words sent a jolt into Fluttershy's heart that sent it hammering away. Never had. Is that why you came out here? Did he? No, that's not. Slowly she turned to face him, but his gaze was settled on the sleeping filly in front of the two of them. In that brief moment, Fluttershy saw something she had never thought she would see on Sombra's face. Something that, even in her wildest fantasies of redemption, she hadn't dared to hope for. His features were softened, completely lacking their usual cool lines, but unlike before when he had been talking to her friends, he wasn't wearing a mask. No, he looked almost relaxed, the ghost of a smile tugging at the edge of his lips when a warm light had settled in his eyes. There was no other word for it. The way he was looking at Skulu was almost parental. Fluttershy opened her mouth, but she found a complete lack of words. What she did find was the urge to do something that was some combination of incredibly stupid, brave, and impulsive. The only words in her brain could give her were bucket. Mouse, are you? Sombra began to turn, but he didn't get to finish his sentence before Fluttershy leaned upwards, almost having to lift herself off the ground to reach him, and pressed her lips against him in a warm, intense kiss. She felt shock roll through him. His surprise only lasted for a moment before, to her pleasant surprise, he leaned in and kissed her back, wrapping her lean form in his forelegs and pulling closer. She didn't even try to resist. She didn't want to. There was so much strength in Sombra, and yet, for some reason, Fluttershy didn't feel even the slightest bit afraid. In fact, for the first time she could remember that wasn't in the middle of a big fight or huge trouble, Fluttershy dared to say that she felt fearless.